Hello and welcome to today's FP Virtual Dialogue, Freeing the State, Strategies for Defending Democracy Around the World, where we'll discuss the democratic backsliding seen globally and the action needed to combat it. My name is Maggie Lake, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator this morning. The world has seen a steady rise of illiberal regimes and democratic backsliding in recent years. Autocrats are employing a range of tactics, including utilizing state resources to corrupt the electoral process and entrench incumbents, and centralizing control of essential technology to limit the autonomy of independent institutions. The overt and increasingly widespread influence of authoritarian leaders is eroding established democracies and posing grave risk to nascent ones. But the decline of democracy worldwide is not inevitable. State actors and other stakeholders have a range of tools that can be leveraged to strengthen accountability, thwart corruption, and build or rebuild public trust. Against this backdrop, we've gathered a group of governance and international relations experts to help us unpack these complex issues and explore the tools and strategies that can be employed to defend democracy. Before diving in, I'd like to extend a big thanks to the International Foundation for Electoral Systems for helping us make this event possible. Before we get started, we want to make sure that we can hear from you, our audience. We have thousands of people tuning in and watching our live streams on social media. We have reserved a portion of this event for questions from our global audience. Here's how you can write to us. If you're on Zoom, click the Q&A button below and submit your questions. Please be sure to tell us your name, organization, and where you're writing from. If you're joining us on the phone or watching the live stream, you can email us your questions. The address is events@foreignpolicy.com. And of course, we encourage you to chime in on social media as well. Be sure to use the hashtag #DefendDemocracy. All right, let's get started. I'm honored to begin our program with Dr. Francis Fukuyama, author and international relations scholar, and the Olivier Alini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for talking to me, Maggie.
So in your latest book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, you take a look at the challenges facing democracies around the world and in the US. Why are we seeing this assault on liberalism?
Well, there's many dimensions to this. Part of it is just geopolitics. You've had the rise of these big authoritarian countries like Russia and China. Russia invaded Ukraine almost a year ago. It was a kind of overt attack on a democracy of a sort we really haven't seen since 1945. People also worry very much about the future of Taiwan. And so this is really something new in our post-World War II international politics. But you've also had the rise within established democracies of populist, nationalist, religious movements. And I think that the one in the United States has had a big global impact. This was the election of Donald Trump and the emergence of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party to take over that party and shift it in a nationalist direction. And since the United States has set a pattern and was a model for democracy around the world, the influence of practices in this country are emulated elsewhere. This used to be a positive example, but it's become a negative one. So, for example, after the election of Lula in Brazil, a lot of Brazilians began imitating the United States and attacking their own government, claiming that there was electoral fraud when there really had been a clean election. And so you have this range of developments all the way from domestic to international. The reasons why you're getting this surge of populism around the world is really complicated, and it has both economic, social, and cultural drivers, but a lot of it does have to do with a kind of unhappiness with the globalized world that had been created over the past generation.
Yeah, so themes of anti-globalization in there as well. Let's talk about the US, because I think that this is very poignant and has affected many people. And this idea that we've become the sort of negative example, or the problem child on the block, if you will. And I know that the election of Donald Trump comes up, but the seeds of this surely must have been sown before that. Can you dig into a little bit about you? And you find responsibility and blame can lie on both ends of the political spectrum, which I find really fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about what you think has transpired on the more conservative side of the political spectrum in the US that led up to the election of Donald Trump? What's changed there that you feel like is deteriorating, or contributing to this backslide in democracy? What's happening politically on the right?
Well, there's a couple of things. So, in a way, everybody is reaping the consequences of the rise of what's called neoliberal economics. This is the kind of free market economics promoted by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that freed up markets, corporations. It created a lot of wealth, but it also created a lot of inequality and a lot of people being left behind as jobs were shipped overseas to East Asia and the like. This, normally you think would help the left, but in fact, in the United States, I think it laid the groundwork for the rise of Trumpism because a lot of those working class Americans interpreted their situation as one that had been the result of a kind of conspiracy of the elites that benefited from globalization but didn't really care about what happened to ordinary, working class Americans. I think there's also a dissatisfaction. Well, there's also something that was going on the left where you had the rise of a progressive wing of, for example, of the Democratic Party that became increasingly illiberal, that didn't accept the fundamental liberal premise of tolerance and acceptance of pluralism. And that in turn set off a lot of reactions in the cultural sphere that we're kind of living through in American politics today.
I think that's so interesting. Do you think that there is a widespread understanding or acceptance of this on the left? It's not something that comes up. There's a lot of blame assigned to the right, and I think understandably in the wake of what's happened with the January 6 riots, but you don't often hear about that discussion around the left.
Well, it's a complicated empirical question because technology has intervened in a way that's kind of scrambled our perceptions of what's going on. And so, the one thing that social media and the internet more broadly has done is to be able to amplify certain voices. And so, regardless of how widespread, let's say cancel culture, certain kind of progressive identity politics is, it's something that, once you see one incident, it gets broadcast all over the internet, and people begin to think that it's a really big phenomenon, whereas it's actually confined to a certain set of issues in, certain usually fairly elite cultural circles. But, I think that's one of the big problems is the ability of the big internet platforms to vastly amplify certain messages, and what they amplify are not necessarily good, credible content, but what gets a lot of clicks because that's what their advertising revenue depends on. They can also silence a lot of voices, and this is kind of the conservative critique coming from Elon Musk and people in that camp who feel that these platforms have unduly biased the people's perceptions of what's actually happening in the world by what they take down and what they promote.
So if we reason backwards from that, is in order for democracy to thrive, do you need a strong center? Because we sort
Well,
of gutted the center in some ways, at least in the political dialogue. And it sounds like, when you're talking about some of the problems that have come up on the right and the left, there is this void of the center that's apparent.
well, there are a couple of dimensions to this. It's true that in the United States in particular, our electoral system tends to privilege the extremes. I think that we've evolved this system of selecting presidential candidates, for example, by popular primaries in uh, both parties, and that creates big incentives for party activists, who are usually the main people that vote in primaries, to be able to push, the Republicans to the right and the Democrats to the left, and that, has led to, the rise of both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in the two parties, and in that sense, uh, the system becomes unrepresentative because there probably are a lot more centrist voters. The other thing is that, the technology doesn't particularly favor moderate or credible voices, and I think, one of the impacts of the internet that we didn't really anticipate was the kind of the leveling of discourse in the online world. When the internet was first privatized in the 1990s, a lot of people, myself included, thought this would be a great thing because it's going to take away the power of media companies, publishers, all the gatekeepers that had been filtering information that people got, and people would have direct access to information, and therefore it would be democratizing. But it turns out that a lot of those gatekeepers were actually performing useful functions in terms of vetting information and making sure that what was published and seen, let's say on the broadcast TV channels, had a certain minimal degree of credibility. And all of that's gone now. So anyone can say anything they want. And again, the things that get the most clicks and the greatest virality are not things that are necessarily credible. They're things that are, salacious or, extreme. And that's kind of the media world that we've descended into.
Yeah, it's a development that I think very few could see coming. And now we're trying to get the genie back in the box and figure out how to address that. I want to ask you a little bit more about the external forces in the geopolitical landscape. But this is such an interesting question coming in, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it. This is from Michael. Many people use the word liberalism and democracy as if they were the same, but are they? All governments want to be democracies, but many do not want to be liberal. What what are your thoughts on that?
No, that's a really critical distinction that a lot of people oftentimes glide over. So liberal democracy is really a combination of two distinct sets of institutions and principles. The liberal part is really about restricting the power of governments over the lives of individuals, and institutionally that means something like a rule of law and constitutional checks and balance that actually limit the power of executives to interfere in the lives of their citizens. The democratic part of liberal democracy really has to do with things like elections, free and fair contestation, accountability, electoral accountability. And I think that it's generally true that the democratic principle is, widely accepted. There are very few people that say, well, there's a certain, narrow group of people that have a right to rule over other people. I mean, that's the fact in Russia and China, but they both claim that, their mandate comes from the people more broadly. And what first comes under attack is really the liberal part of liberal democracy. So you see this, I think, very much in the rise of populist politicians. They're elected in, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Trump in the United States, or Viktor Orban in Hungary. They're elected. Um, and then they say, well, the people elected me to do something, and you have all these judges or bureaucrats or media institutions that are standing in the way of what I want to do. And therefore, their first target becomes the liberal institutions that then, restrict their power. And I think, what you've seen on the part of many authoritarians, including some of our homegrown ones, is a kind of hankering after the sort of executive power that exists in places like uh, Russia and China, which, as far as I can see, is the only explanation for this weird admiration that Donald Trump kept expressing for both Xi Jinping and for Vladimir Putin, because he himself was chafing at the constraints that living in a liberal democracy imposed on him as an elected leader, and it was something that he he was hankering after.
Mm. How has the Russian invasion of Ukraine impacted this discussion?
I think that, in a way, support for liberal democracy comes in waves. And one of the big problems with liberalism is it doesn't necessarily give people, a common communal base of social cohesion because it says you can do whatever you want. It's much preferable to living under a dictatorship. And so in 1945, everybody understood what fascism and communism were about, or after 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so they appreciated living in liberal societies. But I think that over time, you simply begin to take life in a free and peaceful and relatively prosperous liberal democracy for granted, and you begin hankering after other things, a greater sense of community or a greater sense of common purpose. And so you had a gradual complacency develop in the West, in Europe, and in North America that our liberal democracies would simply be there forever. And I think what the Russian invasion did was to remind a new generation of people living in liberal democracies that they couldn't necessarily take that for granted, that there were times when you'd actually have to defend your way of life and your system of government against forces that wanted to impose dictatorship. And so that's why I think the actual unfolding of events, the great solidarity, which to me was quite unexpected that you saw within NATO in terms of support for Ukraine, was actually quite heartening because it did seem to me that people were waking up to the fact that they had collective responsibilities in providing mutual support for other democracies that were under attack in different parts of the world.
Mm. A question from Professor Gadier in Jerusalem. What can academics do against what we perceive as a wall of unlistening?
Well, academics, I think, set the certain background conditions for ideas. If you think about the Reagan revolution or the neoliberal revolution in economics, you had politicians like Reagan and Thatcher that were pushing pro-market policies. But you also had the Milton Friedmans and Gary Beckers and George Stiglers, the highbrow economists that were actually laying the foundations for a much more market-centered approach to economics. Whatever you think about that substantively, these ideas that were being produced by academics were filtering down into ordinary political discourse. And I think that it's the case that, academics can continue to play that kind of a role, to talk to people about, different kinds of political systems, what the relative advantages and disadvantages are that will shape the way that, that power and regimes are perceived around the world. They can also, if they have a more practical bent, actually talk about public policy. This is something that a lot of academics are kind of hesitant to do, but I do think that they can actually contribute ideas substantively to the policy debate.
Mm. What do you see as some of the strategies or solutions in order to stem this backsliding that we're seeing?
Well, because the backsliding has many different causes, there's no single solution. So the geopolitical challenge, that's posed by Russia right now has to be met by weapons, in my opinion. I mean, the support for Ukraine's ability to defend itself is critically important. I think that for Americans, given the kind of negative example that they've been setting for democracies around the world, a big priority is to get our own house in order and to make sure that future elections are truly free and fair, that they're not being manipulated. And then I think that there's a lot of solidarity that needs to happen between democracies. This is something that IFAS does in terms of helping uh, especially new democracies hold actually free and fair elections. And that's something the international community has learned to do. And then I think part of it is just paying attention. There's a lot of violations of democratic practice, violations of human rights that take place around the world. And the democratic world has a duty to notice what's going on, to call out instances of abuse, to protect individuals that are being uh, persecuted by authoritarian regimes, and in general to make the world aware of all of these trends.
Mm. We have a great question, and one that's going to come up, and we'll end it with this. But what are some of the effective strategies of dealing with those who are most susceptible to authoritarian messaging? This person's asking MAGA type ideologies, but I think that you can stretch it beyond that and say, especially younger people. What does the messaging have to be to younger people to sway them against that ideology?
Uh, I wish I knew the answer to this.
It is the $1 million question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about messaging is that it's really not based on rational argument. It's based on, appealing to people's priors. And one of the problems that we've been experiencing in our democracies is what Jonathan Haidt calls motivated reasoning, that people know the conclusions that they want to see supported in advance, and they marshal information, to support those conclusions. And therefore, our problem is really a pretty deep one. If you can't agree on whether a vaccine is safe or whether Joe Biden won the 2020 election, you're going to have a pretty hard time persuading the other side, to climb down off of some of its positions. And so part of the problem, involves restoring the credibility of certain sources of information. So we're actually playing off of a common page. But how you do that, I think, is like the big task that's in front of us, where there is no clear solution to that.
Dr. Fukuyama, this was such an interesting conversation, and the book is fantastic, and I think really important to really dig down to these very deep causes and not easily assign blame to one side or the other, but to understand that collectively that there are really deep causes behind that if we're going to figure out a way forward. So thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
So our next conversation continues to take a closer look at the strategies for combating democratic backsliding. I'm pleased to welcome our panelists, Tom Carruthers, Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Nicolas Schmidt, Executive Director of Democracy Reporting International, and Max Zaldivar, Regional Director for the Americas for IFES. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for being with us. I think I'd like just to go around to each of you first and just get some reaction and thoughts to what we heard from Dr. Fukuyama, and a little bit about your assessment of the state of democracy based on the work that you're doing. Tom, if we could start with you.
Thanks very much. Good to be with you. Well, I really like the way Francis Fukuyama emphasized the complexity of what we're facing. I've been really struck as the trend line towards democracy has gone down in recent years. People tend to latch on to a kind of single factor way of trying to explain things. Oh, it must be social media. Oh, it must be, this government or that government, or it must be economic injustice. And they think a single thing explains this very complex landscape. And then that leads in turn to simplistic solutions. So I think it's important as we start this conversation, not to say we're overwhelmed by complexity. There are clear lines that we can talk about. But just looking at the global landscape, in the last month, we see some bad news. For example, in Israel, where the Netanyahu has proposed an overhaul of the judiciary. That's pretty troubling. We've seen some good news in the Czech Republic, where a pretty undemocratic or illiberal populist was defeated for the presidential election by a pretty credible politician. And we see a lot of uncertainty in Nigeria, where they're about to have elections in 16 days. And a reformist candidate has kind of emerged among the two aging kind of same old type candidates. And we're not sure where it's going. So this just highlights the complexity of the landscape.
Absolutely. Nicola?
Thank you, Maggie. Yeah, very interesting points that Dr. Fukuyama raised. I think it's very important for us to also think about that we not only should talk about a crisis of democracy, but really look to some of the positive developments that we see, as Tom has also highlighted. And that maybe as part of a discussion like the one today, it's really good that democracy supporters like us actually get out there and talk about these positive aspects and what is still going on in the world, to really highlight that democracy is something worth fighting for and worth defending, that democracy delivers around the world, and that even though we see threats to democracy and some backsliding, as we say, democracy is still the form of government that most people, many people in the world aspire to, whether we talk about democracy or then also talk about its liberal aspects that Dr. Fukuyama mentioned, which are those really important guardrails for democracy, like an independent judiciary, the media, freedom of speech, etc.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It was great to get that question in, explaining the difference, and get that in so early, because we can use them interchangeably, and they're not. But Max, this is a very complex issue, and I know that's something that is top of mind for you as you look at the developments in Latin America. This is a complex issue. Again, your reflections and what are you seeing on the ground? Are you more troubled? Are you more concerned about the challenges? Or are there also reasons to be hopeful?
Yes, no, definitely. Latin America, we have our gallery of authoritarian regimes in our past, and it seems that bad habits never die. And now we're seeing this new resurgence of autocrats in our region. I agree with Dr. Fukuyama. I think Latin America is based on our liberal democracy, and that's what's been attacked. Even with our third wave of democracy, which create this new solid political process and the robust economic and adjustment of a free market. But sadly, most Latin Americans do not believe that democracy is working for them, and that the constitutional institutions do not represent their expectations and needs. And that's what we're seeing now with the different examples of authoritarian leadership in a region. There's specific examples that we could go in, but as Salvadorian, I briefly have to mention El Salvador. And my additional concern is the revisionist agenda that he's bringing, right? Like everything in the past is wrong, and from now on, everything what I do is right. In El Salvador, the closest that we have to a social pact are, for example, our peace accords from 1992, and he is destroying every notion that the peace accords ever existed. So that revisionist agenda that he's putting in place is very interesting to keep an eye on. Thank you.
Yeah. To your point, Max, we have a question/comment from an attendee. Is it that people are taking liberal democracies for granted, or is it that liberal democracies are creating increasingly unequal economic and political systems? We see this in both the age income of elected officials as well as the corporate share of profits. Tom, that is a sort of an economic underlying issue, but it's a good question. It's not that we've become complacent. There are people who are saying, as Max just pointed out, this system doesn't seem to be working for me.
No question, but let's keep in mind a couple of things. China has also become much more unequal in the last 20 years. It isn't only democracies that have suffered from inequality. China has pursued its own kind of statist style of quasi-neoliberal economics, and it's produced a lot of inequality. And we see democratic backsliding in a number of countries that actually have not suffered significant growth in inequality. Poland is one example. Poland is a surprisingly sort of strong economic success story relative to its democratic decline. So Poland's economic success over the last 20 years didn't keep the country on the democratic track. Something else caused citizens to start embracing some of these populist ideas and illiberal ideas. So I certainly agree that economic injustice, economic inequality and injustice has been on the rise in a number of countries, democratic and non-democratic. So we need to take the wide landscape there. But I also think we need to, again, not think it's a single factor explanation that's going to explain Poland or Bangladesh, which has also decreased inequality over the last 20 years, yet suffered democratic decline. So there are cases that are puzzling that cause us to go deeper beyond that single factor idea.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. So Tom, what are some concrete tools or strategies that can be used to strengthen democracy?
Well, there are a lot, but let me highlight two that are really important. As elected leaders in a lot of countries, like Max was saying in El Salvador, elected leaders turn against democracy and begin to asphyxiate, strangle democracy. It's critical that opposition forces build greater unity among themselves, not allow themselves to be fragmented among the existing political parties, but also in civil society. So you get broader civic coalitions, broader political coalitions. Democracy has to get onto the electoral agenda, as we saw in the United States in 2022. And when it does, citizens will respond in a positive way. And so in Brazil, we saw in the election recently that a broader coalition, Lula forged by inviting as his presidential candidate someone from the center right, civic coalitions behind him that forged a much broader kind of consensus around him, helped Brazil get beyond a very difficult election, which threatened to return to power a very illiberal leader. So one is coalition building. The second is the information space. Francis Fukuyama referred to this. The information space has moved online in the last 20 years. It's now a virtual information space. It's extraordinarily vulnerable to manipulation, distortion, and all kinds of really terrible things that contribute to democratic decline. Waiting for technology companies to fix this, probably not a good idea. Hoping that governments can pass a few regulations that will fix it, probably not enough. We've got to get engaged, and it's really only citizen education and citizen advocacy and mobilization around learning to parse information, learning to resist disinformation, learning to demand more from technology companies. That's how we're going to recapture the integrity of information space. So more coalitions, fight for a better information space. Those are two good starting points that I'd highlight.
Yeah, and it often comes up that technology can be seen as contributing, but also perhaps part of the solution. It's very tricky, isn't it? Nicola, what are your thoughts in terms of strategies that can help?
In addition to what Tom already said, I think the focus on civil society and participation is really, really important, because they are the ones that can demand from their governments participation, accountability, and more transparency. So focusing on that, especially from my perspective as somebody working in a non-governmental organization that works on supporting democracy around the world, is very important. And as part of that, we need to look at different strategies also from governments, from societies, maybe from businesses, because it's not just a one-sided work. It needs many different actors getting involved. It needs long-term focus. It's not just happening very quickly. But at the same time, we need to act fast, and we need to act in both ways. We need to act to support democracy when we see openings for democracy, but we also need to work on defending democracy when we see that it's being attacked. And this goes also for our own countries, where everybody can be part of this, and it goes for the work of organizations like mine and others in other countries around the world. So really important to work on civil society, support to civil society, opening the civic space to be active in shaping their own country.
When you say defending, being quick to defend democracy, what does that look like? What does that mean in practice?
I think it could mean different things. It could mean either fast money coming to different organizations that are active in countries where there is a certain threat to democracy. I'm thinking, for example, of Sri Lanka. Last year, there were a number of demonstrations. There was a change in the government, in the leadership of the country. And civil society could really do with support for coordinating themselves, for speaking with one voice. Similarly to what Tom said about parties, civil society can also be stronger when they work together. The other thing is really speak out as democracy defenders or supporters, and put democracy on the table as an important issue, as something worth to defend, and be quick to analyze different events in countries where there may be a backsliding. Hungary is often cited as an example where maybe the European Union just kind of, didn't react and kind of slept through all the changes in Hungary. They were much faster in reacting in Poland, but also other people, academics, for example, or analysts, they can react, they can point out and use the space on social media, for example, to highlight what is happening in a particular country and put information out there, highlighting that right there, something is going wrong, we have to do something about it.
Mm. Max, it seems that sort of the information space is critical when we're talking about finding solutions and strategies.
Yes, certainly. As I agree with Nicola, as she said, it's how important it is to strengthen civil society, independent media. But in Latin America, particularly, one of the root causes of the current crisis is also the lack of representation. And we need to strengthen back again and bring up again the political party system, which basically has been vanishing since the beginning of the 90s up to today. People don't feel represented anymore with political parties. I would also like to add the generational relay, which has always been a problem in Latin America. Just look at the age, at the average age of our current leadership. And there are a few exceptions, right? Like Chile and El Salvador. And precisely, I think that youth component is something that needs to be also cemented better in the future for our democracy. Now, on information, I agree. The current trend we're seeing of attacking the elections authority is something new. It's something particular, and it's not only really bad, but it's very hypocritical, because those leaders are using those same institutions not only to gain power, but also to justify their legitimacy. But once they're in power, they don't see them as their allies. And they either attack the leadership of those institutions, they either attack specific steps of elections processes, automatic voting, lack of a voter roll, etc. But the idea, the general idea, is to discredit those institutions, and this is a new trend, and it's really harming democracy overall.
Yeah, we had a question from someone: how can assault on democracy through democratic mechanisms be stopped?
Yes, you need to strengthen institutions, and precisely that's what they are trying to weaken, right? Not only the judiciary and taking control of Congress, and now even attacking independent institutions as electoral authorities, and that is very damaging. And again, our liberal democracy in Latin America is based on that, and that's what we need to strengthen. But I would add the component of inclusion. I think that the two sides of the coins in Latin America has one been our liberal democracy and its strengthening of the institutions, but now we need to add the inclusion side on the other coin, which is very important for our region.
Mm. And what does that inclusion look like?
Inclusion of all the sectors of Latin America, to make it open participation for groups that have been not actively participating. I mean, you can clearly see it. Recently in Guatemala is with a little bit of unrest because one presidential candidate, the only indigenous candidate, has been denied its registration in a country where the percentage of indigenous population is more than 70%. So those are the things that we are still seeing in Latin America and are very troubling.
Tom, we have a great question, and it's impossible to talk about any of this, and especially the importance of information and galvanizing support without talking about the challenge presented by technology. And we have a question: how can can liberal democracies effectively compete with authoritarian states when it comes to emerging technologies like AI? What we've seen transpire, and that now public disclosures of what's possible using artificial intelligence now, I think has scared everyone. From deep fakes to being able to alter video. How concerned are you about that? And can liberal democracies compete with state-controlled entities when it comes to misinformation?
I'm very concerned. It's impossible not to follow the developments in AI and with digitalization more generally without seeing the manifold ways they can pose threats to democracy. Just today in the New York Times, there's a fairly chilling story about the likely use of new AI technologies by those who want to spread disinformation, purify that postings that they put so that they're in the good shape linguistically to come up with ideas for how to present disinformation and so forth. And as you said, both China and the United States are racing to develop AI capabilities. In the United States, more on the private sector, and China on the kind of hybrid state/private sector. And both countries wield tremendous access to data because they're large countries with sophisticated technology sectors. So it's likely to be a very deep and long-lasting competition. But at the same time, the Chinese government also has a concern about deep fakes within its own society and about the use of technologies to challenge it. So it isn't that everybody's going to be for one technology or against another technology. But I think in the United States and in other democracies, again, the AI, the new rush of sort of interest in and excitement about AI needs to make us sort of amp up our concern about how do we get a grip on regulating these technologies, engaging citizens so they can use them in thoughtful ways, because technology is on steroids, but we're constantly playing catch up to the threat that they play to our own countries and to our own democracy.
Absolutely. We have a great comment from Julie Fisher-Melton. Democratization at the local level in Tajikistan is alive based on local organizations and the internet. This continues despite an authoritarian national government. Please talk about local democratization. Nicola, how can we support local actors and what role can they play?
Yeah, it's a very good point, mate. And it's a good example, actually. I don't know that much about Tajikistan, but we've done work in other countries, for example, in Libya, where we've been working very much at the local level in different municipalities, working with the local government and working with citizens to get them to access their local government, access information and influence what the government is actually doing, or working again with civil society at the local level and supporting different coalitions. Again, an example from Libya, where we've been working with a coalition of women NGOs. So there's quite a lot of ways where this can be done. But as I said before, it's something that really takes time. It needs presence, it needs support, it needs financial support, and it needs people who are actually doing the building up relationships, building up networks. But it's something that we shouldn't forget. It's really important to go beyond a capital of a country and look at what's happening in other areas, in smaller towns, in the rural areas, and what happens with people who are not part of the political or economic elite.
Yeah, Max, I think this is what you were touching on before when you were talking about inclusion. And we just heard Nicola mention women and the role women potentially can play in this. Is there a gender component in terms of pulling more women into the system that can help on this front? What are you seeing in Latin America? Did we lose Max?
We don't have Max. I think
he
yes. He might have dropped off. He'll come back.
I'd be happy to.
Yes, Tom, if you want to pick that up too.
Nicola, would you like to? Please.
No, please go ahead.
Women's political empowerment over the last 30 years is one of the big success stories of democratization. Women are much more politically empowered in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, as well as in Europe and North America, compared to where they were 30 years ago. To such a degree that what we're now seeing as part of the democratic recession, we're seeing a lot of concerted pushback against the gains that women have made. And in a way, pushback is a sign of success. It means you were threatening vested interests. It means you were getting real and getting important, as women have been all over the world in the last 30 years. And so women's political empowerment isn't just a sort of nice to have, it's fundamental to combating the democratic recession. And we have to really learn about, how did we get those successes and how can we push back against the pushback? I have a colleague, Saskia Breckenmacher, terrific analyst, who's just finishing a book that'll be out soon from Oxford on examining the lessons of fostering women's political empowerment around the world over the last 30 years. So I feel very strongly about this issue. And I get irritated when people treat it as a kind of a fringe issue or a nice to have. It's not nice to have, it's gotta have.
No,
can I just agree with Tom on that? It's a gotta have, and it's really, really important. It's something that there should be continued focus on women's empowerment and women's participation around the world. And it's also shown, it's maybe a little bit dry, but research shows that if women are empowered and if there's more gender equality, then there's also less conflict, in the same way that research shows that democracies can actually deliver on a number of things, such as equality, such as education, health, or public services.
Yeah, in much of the work that happens at the UN, in terms of the SDGs, women equality happens to be one that once you check that box, an awful lot of other boxes get checked and lifted up at the same time. So there is a superpower to that. We have a lot of questions coming in about the role. This is the simplest way to put it. To what degree is the reputation of the United States linked to the health of liberal democracy on a global level? And Tom put another way, how should we approach the rise of skepticism among developing countries on the US? Is democracy superior to Chinese authoritarianism in national capacity perspective? Actually, Max is back with us. So Max, welcome back. I'm going to put this to you because
I apologize. There were some internet.
That's okay. That's okay. It happens to all of us. We were just talking about the importance of bringing women into the political system as an important tool in this, but this is a question about the role of the United States, and in particular, the skepticism. How do we approach the rise of skepticism among developing countries toward the U.S.? Is democracy superior to Chinese authoritarianism in terms of national capacity perspective? And I know this is an issue for Latin American companies, some of which have been developing closer ties, certainly through trade with China. What is the role of the U.S., especially in light of the fact that Dr. Fukuyama said that, we've seen backsliding here and things, an assault on democracy here in a way that would have been shocking. It's shocking still to many, but would have been unheard of even 5-10 years ago. How is that influencing the conversation or what you're seeing in Latin America?
No, absolutely. Our region, its proximity to the United States and our independent history is so very close, and our political history is so very close tied to the United States. And yes, and the comparison that Dr. Fukuyama made with that uncivil unrest that happened in the US in 2020 and then Brazil in 2022 are really shocking. But going back into China's influence, yes, we're seeing it. We're seeing it in Latin America more and more today, actually in my country, not just to continue on that line of El Salvador, but in our country, we're seeing now China building the largest soccer stadium that is supposed to be in the Central American region. So the influence is there. It has definitely damaged the relationship of those countries with the United States, and we don't know what else is on their agenda, right? And it's not only going to continue to be the deteriorating relationship, but also it's going to have a huge impact on the internal development of the democracies in those countries.
Tom, we've been talking about the challenges, how to address the strategies in order to address the backslide or the loss in faith in democracy. Can we flip the conversation a little? How is democracy uniquely positioned to tackle some of the challenges the world faces? What's the positive messaging around this? And I'll bring in an observation question to this, but Gonzalo writes, isn't the problem with democracy, we speak of political democracy, but Putin and others speak of economic democracy as a goal, and that's what's ultimately important to people. How is democracy uniquely positioned, and does there have to be a reboot of the sort of conversation around that?
Well, I think we have to get to the fundamentals and keep emphasizing them, particularly with the younger generation. A country like Nigeria with a huge population, over 200 million people, 60% of the population is under 25 years old. So when we talk about, what are the messages about democracy, we have to think about what's on the mind of the young people. What's on the mind of young people everywhere is a mix of individualism of, I want to live my life my way. If I want to post this on Instagram or this on TikTok, I want to do that because that's me. Yet also at the same time, this is what makes it complex, a hunger for connectedness and a hunger for solidarity and a feeling of no one cares about our generation and the older generation ate everything up. And so you have to say democracy is a system where you get to post that thing. You get to be yourself. It's a society that can be individualistic in ways that people want. Then when it comes to solidarity, you have to say it is also possible in democracies. In democracies, people can associate, they can communicate with each other, they can form interest groups. It's not a patriarchal society where authority has everything to say. So you have to speak to the core desires and concerns of people. They want the individual freedom, the ability to be themselves in their own ways, and they also want some kind of solidarity. So before we get to messages about which system delivers the economic goods more, you're going to end up with a lot of arguments that are not very clear, even though if you look at the Human Development Index, 45 out of the 50 most successful countries on the Human Development Index are democracies. The other 5 are oil-rich states. So if you say, look, who does have the track record of success on human development over time? It is actually democracy. But I think get to the fundamentals of the desire for individual expression, the desire for solidarity, and show that democracy, speak clearly to this point, democracy is the system that can develop that.
Very well said, Tom. And I really like you identifying the fact that young people feel like the older generation's just eaten everything up and that they're forgotten. I think that really rings true with young people I talk to. And Max, we have a question from Fernanda on that point. In Latin America, the weaknesses of the state and its ability to fight organized crime, corruption, abusive enterprises as an entity, is it confused with the weakness of democracy as a political system for the people in the region? Are autocracies responding better to these regional problems? That's a great point. Again, is democracy getting labeled with failing on those points when it's really just the people who are there? How do you respond to that?
It is a great point. And yes, specifically, those are the tools that those autocrats use, right? And that they use in their advantage to advance their political and national agenda. And again, going back to my country, that's a great example of what is happening. The high numbers of popular acceptance and ratings of the current president is precisely because he's tackling issues that in El Salvador has been lingering for so on, and no other government has been able to really counter those. And finally, he's taking into that particular issue of crime, violence, and gang-related violence in El Salvador. And honestly, what he has done is impressive. But yes, is there a price to pay? Yes. Is there collateral damage? Is there abuse of human rights while he's doing this? Yes. But the average citizen is just seeing that he can go back to sell his goods in the streets where he wasn't able to do business a month ago. And that is something that definitely these type of autocrats are taking advantage of. And those are the specific areas that they're focusing on. Similar was in Brazil, the hard image of Bolsonaro, the tackling issues that nobody has tackled before. And so that's what needs to be countered. But the concerning aspect is that there's no opposition to really able to counter those actions of these authoritarian leaders. They are disarmed. They just don't know how to react to what they are doing. And they are leaving the way free for example, in El Salvador, a re-election in 2024, and for other examples in the region.
Nicola, as we start to wrap up here, very fantastic point made by Natalia, I believe. If we think of community knowledge as a strategy tool in order to work for democracy and protect it, what role do you think new generations are going to play, especially in contexts like Latin America or developing countries where people want to be more involved in politics and redefine the way the system works?
Very good and very complex question. I think it brings together a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. And it shows also that there needs to be more talk and listening to these communities, and kind of circling back to the United States being a good or a bad example. I think whatever it is, it's very important to look at other examples as well around the world and other countries that are democratic or that are democratizing or that have democratic practices that are good and that are interesting and that maybe can be emulated in other places. And especially when looking at the next generation, the young people, we've already said they want to be part of this. They maybe feel left out. They feel like the old generation is taking everything from them. But we also need to look at how can they actually participate? How can we support them in their participation? How can we reach them? And maybe turning social media into one of the channels that we can reach them through, and not just looking at social media as, the big danger and, the forum where polarization is amplified, but also the forum where maybe democratic views can be amplified and people can be reached.
Yeah, Max, I think you made the point before about younger people in politics, having people that they can relate to. And is that a way to sort of rebuild the political party system, which you say is deteriorating somewhat in Latin America? What role do you see the young playing?
Yes, certainly. Latin America, it's a region of young people. We're seeing them more and more becoming actively, but unfortunately, the political organizations and the institutional framework is not allowing for that youth to take over. There are isolated cases, like I said before, Chile, El Salvador, and some others, but there's really not that big movement, and that's something that needs to change. I think if we can find a real Democrat and young, and they find that same peer that they identify with, they will follow. But finally, since I know we're running out of time, I want to quickly mention check and balances, which I know we did mention. What happened in Latin America a decade or 2 decades ago is that leftist populists swamped horizontal accountability and check and balances with vertical accountability. And now we're seeing current autocrats doing the same. Basically, they change the institutional reach to limit and account power and dismantle it in favor of informal institutions, patronage, and clientelism. And we're seeing the exact same replica, the same blueprint that some leftist government did a decade or 2 decades ago with the current new phase of authoritarian regimes. Thank you.
And Tom, let's finish off with you. What message would you like to leave us with? And we should point out that we've got an age issue here when it comes to, in the U.S., when it comes to young people being able to serve. We have an increasingly aging Congress and group running for the president too. So I suppose we are guilty of the same. But what message would you like to leave people to, and sort of call to action when it comes to what can be done in their local area?
Well, democracy is on the agenda in the United States and in the world. It's on the table. It's not a given. There's a lot of good news and a lot of bad news at the same time out there. But the good news is going to predominate if people realize it's in their hands at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level. It's by the small actions that accumulate across many different groups, many different parts of the country or parts of the world that are going to make a difference. So in a way, it should be heartening. Democracy is in our hands. It's on the agenda. Let's seize it and let's move forward.
I have to say, so many of the comments and observations coming in were so fantastic today. By the way, we're certainly not going to have time to get to them all, but we will have the page up and try to get all the comments to our panelists, and hopefully they can respond to them as well and keep the conversation going afterwards. But it has been fantastic to have all of you with us. Thank you so much to Tom, to Nicola, and to Max for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you very much.
Well, today's conversation has been enlightening and rich with examples of how governments and organizations can defend democracy. It is a complex and important topic that you will continue to see FP cover. A big thanks again to IFAS for supporting today's event. We hope you'll join us for upcoming events. Stay tuned for more updates from us and find out more at foreignpolicy.com. Take care, and we'll see you soon.